Your first impression of this position may not exactly fill you with optimism. After all, white is technically down material, and even though we have an extra knight, black isn't exactly going to lose any sleep considering they have 5 pawns of their own. In addition to this material deficit, king's safety also doesn't appear to be on our side, as the king appears quite vulnerable to attack with moves such as rook a1 or rook c2 in the air. By comparison, black's king appears to live in a palace, protected by 3 loyal pawns, as well as the queen on f8. And one other thought related to materialism is that the knight, as well as the rook on b4, are both hanging. Okay, with all this said, let's not resign just yet. After all, white is on the move, and white does have active pieces. The queen is aligned with the enemy king down the g-file, and the knight and 2 rooks are able to contribute to a kingside attack. With this in mind, you may be tempted to play knight e6, attacking the queen while adding a second attacker against the g7 pawn. This means that if black plays a move such as queen f7, vacating the back rank, rook b8 leads to mate. And the rook on b4 is immune from capture, as this would allow mate on g7. Although this does attack the queen and add pressure against black's kingside, it's simply not forcing enough, allowing black to expose our vulnerable king with rook c2, preparing to meet king b3 with rook b2. And we actually reach a similar position after king a3, as black can force the king to b3 with rook a1, preparing to meet king b3. Seemingly a good situation, attacking both the rook and pawn on c3. But this falls after rook b2, forcing the king to take the pawn, when black's queen enters the action by capturing the rook, with check, when after king d3. You can basically choose your own checkmate, one of them being rook a3. Black's harmonious major pieces overwhelmed white's fragile defenses. Since black's pieces are all too eager to attack our vulnerable king, we definitely feel an incredible sense of urgency in the position. Okay, it is true that we talk about forcing moves first, but it's easy to reject queen g7 as a random move. But when you have a forcing move like this available, especially in such a desperate situation, we have to consider the details before simply rejecting this move as absurd. If white has any chance in winning this game, we have to attack the enemy king. Notice the g7 pawn is an essential shield for the king on the g-file, and black's queen is protecting the vulnerable back rank. We need to find a way to disturb the balance of these key defenders. Well, if queen takes g7 is such a silly move, we'll be able to reject it quite quickly. The truth is, queen takes g7 is our winning solution. Once we overcome the significant psychological hurdle of how absurd this move appears, the concrete details prove quite favorable for white. Our calculation task is simplified as we only have to consider 2 responses. Let's take a look at the road not taken, starting with queen takes g7. The queen does shield its king on the g-file, but what about the space it left behind? Now that the queen is no longer on f8, this allows the forcing rook e8, forcing the enemy queen to reluctantly block the check. Once again, we can take advantage of the space left behind. This time, the queen vacated the g-file, allowing our other rook to pay a visit to the enemy king with rook g4, forcing king h8. When rook f8 is one direct solution, ending the game. You may also appreciate the picturesque knight f7, delivering a beautiful mate, compliments of the pinned queen on f8. Once we realize that capturing with the queen allows a forced mate, we're only left to calculate the puzzle continuation, king takes g7. Once we overcome the barrier of sacrificing our queen, this is the other critical moment. Forking the king and queen may be tempting. We don't want to get distracted by chasing down material. We've sacrificed too much to stop here. We have to play for mate. We now have to answer the critical question, which rook should move to the g-file? The puzzle solution will allow us to appreciate the distance the rook on b4 enjoys from the enemy king and queen. If white decides to attack with the b rook, it is true the rather compliant king h6 allows rook h3, but black doesn't have to be so eager to stumble into mate in 1, and instead hide behind its pawn. At this point, there's simply no follow-up. We've reached a dead end. Since white's rook is on the king side with limited mobility, the more flexible move, as well as the only winning option, is attacking the king with rook g3. Once again, king h6 allows mate in 1. And since the knight blocks the king from accessing f7, the king is forced into the corner with king h8. Thanks to keeping the rook on the queen side, this makes all the difference in the world, allowing us to clear the back rank with knight f7. attacking the enemy king while clearing the knight from the 8th rank. Black's queen is forced to capture our knight, completely clearing the back rank, allowing rook b8. We've completely destroyed the enemy defenses, and Black's only choice is to block with the queen. In the puzzle, the queen decides to sacrifice itself on e8, when we're able to checkmate the enemy king with rook takes e8.